This video is sponsored by Only Crits. Apologies if I seem a little croaky, I filmed an hour-long video, so. Ever since the earliest days of this channel, I've been talking about metagaming in games like Dungeons & Dragons. For those unfamiliar with the term, metagaming refers to using your player knowledge in the game in a way that your character wouldn't be able to do. I'll give you an example. I mean, this entire video is going to be examples, but here's one just to establish what we mean by this term. A few years back, I got to sit in on a session of Kelly Lynn D'Angelo's home game. We were Facebook friends. She put out a call last minute for a player to join the table. I was available and I was able to sit in for a session. And as I sat down and the player started describing what had happened in the campaign so far, I realized that they were playing Hoard of the Dragon Queen. I had already read this campaign book. In fact, I'd tried to run it twice, although both campaigns fell apart for different reasons. Her group was in the final chapter of the book, heading toward the final encounter before moving on to the Rise of Tiamat. And in this section of the adventure, there's a magical device that operates for anyone who knows the password. And having read the book already, I knew the password. I didn't actually remember the exact word, but I knew where it could be found. If this were a scene in a movie where the characters look around someone's desk trying to find the post-it note with the computer password on it, imagine that I already knew exactly which of the post-it notes was the correct one. Now that knowledge isn't something my character would have had, so I didn't act on it. I was a guest player anyway, and my feeling when sitting in on a campaign is that my goal is to help the regular players shine, so I wanted them to figure it out, but regardless, I didn't tell them the password, because that would have been metagaming. However, one thing I've noticed when watching a lot of Critical Role, or really any actual play show where you get to see how a lot of different groups play in ways that you and your players don't, is that metagaming takes a lot of different forms, and not all groups feel equally about every version of metagaming. Now, this can be a contentious subject in the community because metagaming, in some sense, breaks the reality of the game world and disrupts the fun of people who care about certain levels of immersion. And in some cases, metagaming to gain an advantage is effectively a form of cheating. And when a hobby is structured entirely around a game, people have very strong feelings about anything that feels like cheating. So if there's something in this video that you don't agree with, remember that I'm just one person offering my perspective, and I'm just trying to help you figure out how you might want to run your games and find the style that's best for you. I'm not telling you the right way to play. Now that that's out of the way, let's discuss the worst form of metagaming that everyone universally agrees is awful. Monster Statblock Knowledge, aka, I know this power from the monster's Statblock. Despite what some very online D&D fans will tell you, there are very few hard and fast rules in TTRPGs. But one that I'm fairly certain just about everyone agrees on is this. Part of the fun of a game like Dungeons & Dragons is encountering cool monsters. And when those encounters take place, I feel like half of our job as a DM includes building tension and suspense and atmosphere. And after hours or maybe even several sessions worth of setup, when the party finally encounters the ancient mummy rising from their sarcophagus, dust crumbling from their joints, bugs skittering across their tarnished golden jewelry, speaking a long-dead language laced with vile magic, nothing takes the wind out of our sails worse than when a player says, "It's okay, they're vulnerable to fire damage. I blast a firebolt at him. Don't worry, I'll double the damage before I tell you the total." Now, sure, if you've been playing with the same crew for a while, this can happen, and you can subvert their expectations by putting new spins on familiar monsters. But that doesn't change the fact that, as a player, this is generally considered a dick move. But I DM for a lot of players who also run their own games, so some of this is inevitable at my tables. I've adjusted my tactics so my reveals for one of my groups no longer hinge on hiding this sort of information. Instead, I try to find other twists in different ways. But my favorite players are the ones who, whenever a monster shows up that they're familiar with, will ask the DM if they've ever heard of this kind of monster or know anything about it. Maybe they'll ask to roll an Arcana check or a Religion check or whatever is most appropriate to identify a monster. Or maybe they'll just trust the DM to call for the roll if it makes sense. And if I ever hear a player say, "Oh, I know what this is, but my character doesn't, so I'm not going to say anything," then I want to kiss that player on the lips. If you, as a player, play the same game for long enough, even across different editions, there's an element of this that is hard to avoid. Heck, if someone watches an actual play show or two, there's a chance they're going to pick up some details about a couple of monsters. And by the way, this isn't always about stat blocks. Sure, sometimes it is, but sometimes it's about lore. The people of your world might know about liches, or they might not, more on that in a minute, but do they know about phylacteries? While there is a huge difference between someone knowing lore from across several different editions of the game, and possibly some lore from several thousand years of mythology, There's also some shades of gray here, where knowing the lore can still give the player a distinct advantage in combat. And some of this is a Session Zero conversation. I've never actually said this to my Sunday afternoon group because it didn't occur to me until I was writing this script, and we're playing Monster of the Week right now, and I'm a player, so it doesn't matter right now. But when I go back to running a game for them, I'll probably tell them, I know all three of you are DMs, so I know you know these monsters well. If I want to give you a surprising experience, I'll reskin or I'll homebrew something, but for core monsters, you can act on the knowledge you already have as long as you're not pulling up stat blocks to check on information. But for other games, I much prefer being able to bring players in who haven't had that experience. And if I run another game for mostly new players, then I'll pull any veterans aside and say, please play along. If you know about a monster as a player, ask me what, if anything, your character knows about it. Either I'll make a judgment call or I'll ask you for a roll. But what if your character is dumb? How much should they know? Incongruous monster knowledge, aka my fighter with an intelligence of 7 knows all about this kind of monster. Okay, so maybe your players don't actually know the statistics from the book, so they aren't abusing knowledge of that information, but you're okay with them having some familiarity with the monsters they've read about already or seen in other campaigns. But what if the character they're playing has a really low intelligence? Or, even disregarding their stats, what if they've been playing their character as someone who is very sheltered and oblivious? Because truthfully, it doesn't actually matter what's on the character sheet. Well, that might not be something everyone here agrees on, and we will have to have a deeper conversation some other time about whether your character stats can and should always define your behavior at the table, and whether stupid characters have to have low intelligence, and whether low intelligence characters have to be played as dumb, but that's a discussion for another day. That's not what we're talking about today. But the point I'm making is that there can be multiple different reasons why you, as a DM, or the other players, feel that someone's player character wouldn't have knowledge about a certain kind of monster. Now, there are two factors to this. One is what we just discussed a moment ago. How much player knowledge do you mind in general? If the answer is, generally I don't mind, but for stupid or sheltered or oblivious characters, then it bothers me more, then believe it or not, this is actually a world-building question. I know it may not seem like it, but bear with me. Sure, a stupid character might not know the taxonomy of every kind of monster from a rulebook like this, and might not know the difference between a dragon or a wyvern or a fairy dragon based on what's written in this book. But here's a counterpoint. They aren't just monsters in a book to the characters who live in this world. They're dangerous, wild animals. And while a character might not have ever encountered one of these creatures, you can make the argument that they could have easily still heard stories about these monsters. The dumbest person in our world still knows the difference between a lion and a tiger, even if they've never encountered them. And honestly, I lied a moment ago. I called these monsters dangerous wild animals, but honestly, that's the best case scenario. A lot of these creatures in this book are sentient, and are active threats to all life in a community. The better analogy for a manticore might not be lions and tigers, it might be serial killers. The fairy tales the parents of this world tell their kids aren't just morality lessons to keep them safe. They're almost like true crime podcasts teaching young people the fantasy equivalent of stranger danger. And honestly, in the case of your biggest threats, your red dragons and your liches, these are forces that are out there existing in the world only kept at bay by the actions of people you've never met. In theory, nothing is stopping them from descending on your village and destroying everyone you've ever met. These are almost like hostile foreign nations. Maybe even literally, these creatures might rule enemy nations like Zaz, Tam, and Thay. And just like hostile foreign nations in our own world, the people who live in the world of your game probably know something. Everyone who lives in our world knows something about the nations their government doesn't get along with. Heck, the dumbest person in the United States still knows the difference between Russia, China, and North Korea. I know that for a fact because then in 2016 we made him the president, and he bragged about how well he got along with those nations' leaders. Now, does this bother you? Not me making a political joke, that should be par for the course by now, but does a stupid character knowing details about monsters bother you? Then once again, I recommend this is something you talk about in your Session Zero. Discuss this with your players and figure out not just what is reasonable for everyone to know about the world and the monsters in it, but also how you all expect someone with a really low stat should behave. Because that's a big part of this discussion, the expectations for what is and isn't realistic for someone of below average intelligence, or just someone who is role-played with a very oblivious mentality to actually know about the world. And since we're comparing some of these high-level monsters to foreign powers, what if there was propaganda about these monsters? That would be really fascinating. Nope, stop. I gotta stay on task, even though that is a fascinating idea. Maybe something I can discuss in my villains series? I don't know. We'll come back to that. But of course, it makes a lot of sense for the people of your world to know something about monsters. After all, as we know from the plot hooks of so many D&D adventures, a monster can show up at any time and ruin everyone's day. But what about the other major aspect of a D&D world? What about magic? Magical knowledge, aka, I know what that spell was even though my current character can't cast it. Regardless of how you feel about players having knowledge about the creatures and monsters of your D&D world, knowledge of magic is a totally different animal, no pun intended. For one thing, magic is something that a lot of the player classes have access to, and some of them will probably look ahead and see what cool abilities they might get in the future. That is a very reasonable thing for someone to do when creating their character or leveling up. They're going to shop around and maybe start planning ahead. Additionally, all of the spells are either in the player's handbook or in another sourcebook that has player options in it. So by definition, they're different from monster stats, which are kept in their own books. Except when they're not. Actually, a lot of the time, the monster stat blocks are also in a book with player options, but because the first and biggest monster book stands apart as its own book, we have the mentality that monster stats are not meant for players. We just talked about that, you remember. But spells don't work that way. So how could it be metagaming to talk about those? Well, again, what if you don't think it's realistic that a character would know about magic or about certain kinds of magic? This is one that personally bothers me a lot in certain situations, although not all the time. Much like the reveals of monsters, there are some times when the player knowing something about a spell cast by my villain actually gives them a lot of useful information that I'm intending them to have. In those cases, I don't really care if the character knows the spell, I'm fine with them applying their knowledge to the situation. For example, a Drider casting Cone of Cold isn't just telling the party that she knows a spell that does a lot of damage. It tells savvy players that she probably knows a lot of powerful spells. That's useful knowledge, and it can help them make sound strategic decisions. However, I also don't like it when players think of the world as if barbarians and fighters and paladins are all different in the world, and not just different rules for the game. And trust me, we will get to that later. And magical knowledge plays into that as well. Again, how much is reasonable for the people of your world to know about magic? It's tempting to say that they know as much about magic as we know about science in our world, but does that hold up? After all, we learned about science in school. How common are schools in your world? What does education look like for the common people? See how this is a world-building question again? And even if the populace is educated, we learned about science by doing a bit of science, by making baking soda volcanoes and dissecting frogs. And unless the world of your game is extremely high fantasy, it's pretty unlikely that the common people learned about some introductory magic in their adolescence. But honestly, there's another danger that comes with metagaming about magic, especially if you talk about the spells another player character knows that you don't. And that risk is that you are talking about these spells because you're trying to give someone else guidance on how they should play. Now, this isn't always the end of the world, but it's a slippery slope. When I played my 20-level wizard character, I felt it was perfectly reasonable that my character would know a lot about the spells our druid has access to. Somehow all the spells I knew about were spells I'd seen cast on Critical Role. That's interesting, what a bizarre coincidence. But what I was doing, with the benefit of hindsight, was trying to tell our druid what to do. Now, some strategic discussions are reasonable. Your character should be able to sit down and compare magic to figure out how to solve problems. That's fine. And it's reasonable that your character probably knows the magic the other player characters have access to, because they hang out together and, live in the world that you and I only visit for a few hours every week. Plus, my argument was that wizards know a lot about magic. That's a bit of a slippery, that one's a little bit more of a gray area, but that was my rationale. But this is a type of metagaming where I get really wary of not specifically the type of knowledge being deployed, but how that knowledge is being used in the game. Honestly, it seems like that's true for a lot of these, isn't it? Metagaming isn't always problematic because of the use of knowledge. Sometimes the real issue is the abuse of knowledge, and using your knowledge of another player's spells to try to guide them to play the way you want them to is absolutely abusing that knowledge. And that might not be what everyone does when they talk about spells their characters don't have, but I know it's what I was doing. Of course, while we're talking about characters not knowing things, there's a pretty clear one that is fairly undeniable: knowing what's happening in other locations. Omnipresent knowledge, aka I know what the other characters are up to. When you're playing a tabletop RPG, it's almost inevitable that there will be a moment where your characters don't know what the other characters are up to, yet you as players do. This is probably because all of these scenes need to be resolved by the DM at the table together, so you're a witness to sequences your character wouldn't know about, at least not in real time. And then a player might act on this information by, for example, having their character enter a room at what they consider to be a convenient time, or chime into a conversation while forgetting, or ignoring, that their character wasn't present for it. Now, the word forgetting is important there because this is one of the easiest forms of metagaming to do by accident. When that happens, it can be resolved with a simple, "You're not there." Hell, even if the player isn't trying to propose their character is present, they're just talking out of character and offering advice or commentary. Reminding them that they're not there is a great way to remind them to keep the focus on the players in the scene, and allow them to have their own agency. But honestly, that player agency is exactly why this is probably my second least favorite form of metagaming when I see someone do it out in the wild. As a demonstration of why, let's run through two hypothetical scenarios. In one, the wizard is researching the backstory of the lich they're preparing to fight when they find something, a link that connects them to the fighter's noble family. The player, Clara, says, "Boy, I really wish Dave's character was here so I could talk to him about it." Dave's playing that fighter. At that moment, Dave describes his noble fighter entering the room saying something like, "Hey, I just came in to use the privy, don't let me bother you." In this scenario, sure, the player is metagaming, but they're doing so in a way that benefits the player who they're walking in on, and in a way specifically that serves the goals of Clara's wizard and moves the story forward. Now the characters can compare notes and see what, if anything, the fighter knows that can serve their goal. Now let's take that exact same scenario, but remove that statement from Clara. Instead of wanting to talk to Dave's character, Clara specifically says to the DM that their wizard wants to do more research before doing anything else, so they can figure out what's going on. Or, they don't say anything. They don't make a request for Dave's fighter to arrive. And then Dave announces that his character happens to wander in at this exact moment and say something like, "Hey, let me know how I can help you. My life is an open book." Okay, that was awfully nice of him. Except maybe Clara didn't want that. And regardless, we were in the middle of Clara's scene, and it would have been nice if her wizard had the opportunity to make a decision on their own. That action of Dave's removed a ton of agency from Clara and her wizard. And while it might have been well-meaning, it still ultimately wasn't Dave's call to make, and it was an especially disruptive way for him to use his knowledge to serve his character. That's why it's probably my second least favorite form of metagaming. But what's my least favorite? Well, we'll get there, don't worry. I want to take a break here and just acknowledge what a buck wild year 2023 has been so far for the TTRPG community, and it is only April. We had a bunch of drama and a new big budget movie within just 3 months of each other. That is some fairly extreme whiplash. And honestly, after the ups and downs of these past few months, we all deserve something nice, something special. Which is why today's video is sponsored by OnlyCrits. OnlyCrits is an online dice store that has some truly incredible selections. If you want metal dice, they've got them. Sharp-edged dice? Got them. Your classic polyhedrals without bells and whistles? Sorry, but even their standard dice are stunning. Also, they have dice that have little ducks in them. They are so cute. If you visit onlycrits.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout, then anything you purchase helps to support this channel. Once again, that's onlycrits.com/supergeekmike. Thank you so much to OnlyCrits for sponsoring this video. Now, where did we leave off? Oh yeah, more metagaming. Hooray! Specific Dungeon Master Knowledge, aka don't trust that NPC, this DM always pulls the same twist. If you've been running a lot of D&D games, then you might start to develop tropes and patterns in your games and not even realize it. But if you play with some of the same players for a long time, then they might start to call out some of these examples, and then you'll find out really quickly whether or not you have patterns in your games. Now, full disclosure, this might not bother you. In fact, Matt Colville has a video about metagaming, and he said that he actually likes it a lot when his players are able to identify some part of his style. To him, it shows that they're paying attention, and perhaps even that they're thinking about the game on the same terms as the DM. But speaking completely personally, I don't? Well, I don't always. There are some times when a player identifying something I've got going on in my head means that they are paying attention, and that we're on the same wavelength. But other times, it feels to me like they're being taken out of the game. Or to be more accurate, that they're thinking of the game as just that, a game. And there are plenty of times when that's an extremely valuable mentality, especially when it means preventing further friction at the table. I've made videos about that before, and I probably will again. But I run games that like to highlight immersion, that reward role-playing in character even when it's not beneficial to the characters. And when the players specifically call out what I am or am not planning or doing, that just doesn't always sit right with me. In fairness, Matt Colville often shares a similar feeling when his players say something like, "I bet the DM wants us to do this." And there's a similar feeling there, but I think my threshold for how much of that bothers me is maybe more sensitive than his. which is fine. We have different styles and different groups. He's been playing a lot longer through many different versions of the game. We don't have to see eye to eye on this one. But there's another version of this that bothers me a lot less. And I don't know why, because they're almost exactly the same thing. General story knowledge, aka, oh, I know what's going to happen. This is a classic twist in fiction. This one doesn't bother me at all. And honestly, we could have a whole other, much longer conversation about how most people have a lot more meta knowledge about story structure these days, thanks to the internet and social media making insights more accessible, and thanks to the fact that we have had unrestricted access to behind-the-scenes content on DVDs for decades. We could talk about why that's sometimes good and sometimes bad, and how CinemaSins poison the brains of online discourse about stories, but we can set all of that aside for today. The point is, for a lot of reasons, your players will probably have a pretty good sense of what to expect if your story follows a typical story structure from a movie or a book or a TV show. And you don't have to follow any of those beats in your game, although you and your players might be doing it unconsciously. That's another thing we'll have to talk about another day. I'm going to do at least a few videos about story structure in the future. But for right now, just to make it easier, let's accept the premise that your campaign probably has some story beats that your players might recognize from other media. And it's possible, I dare say it might even be likely, that your players will be able to guess stuff based on their knowledge about stories. They might predict twists or figure out insight into your villain's plans or motivations faster than expected, all because they have a healthy sense of media literacy. Now, this doesn't bother me because this is the one where I feel it's totally fair, even expected, if the players are paying enough attention to the story. Isn't that funny? I don't care about a twist being guessed if it's something that reminds them of pop culture, something that directly implies I'm not being as original as I might like. But if I tell a story that's uniquely me, to the point where I'm playing into patterns that my players have picked up on, then it bothers me more. I suspect the reason why is that it's actually extremely likely that I'm telling a story that's deliberately reminiscent of a movie or a TV show or a book. I have no shame about doing that. But if my players are able to identify something I do as a DM, then that kind of means that I'm being unoriginal in an unintended way. Of course, that doesn't have to be the case. The example Matt Colville cited in his video had less to do with a story beat and more to do with the way monsters operate in the world. And in that case, while your characters might not have as much of a sense of how monsters operate as their players might, if they played with you before, it does still reflect that they're paying attention and understanding your world in a way that might be really rewarding. But for me, since I tend to tell extremely narrative games, I don't want them to guess my twists. But if I'm employing well-known tropes, then I'm okay with the players figuring those out, because that tells me they're on the same wavelength as me. This is what I mean about how not all versions of metagaming are created equal. For example, there's another kind of metagaming that bothers me so much, I literally changed my style as a dungeon master so I would not have to deal with it as much. Dice rolls knowledge, aka, the DM just rolled, or, well, I know I failed that perception check, so there's something here. I hate it when players try to act on different information because they know they rolled low. For example, let's take a perception check. If I call for a roll and the player rolls like a 6, they can be pretty sure there's something they didn't see, that there is something to see that they just missed. And so many times other players will ask to roll, or that player will specifically talk about the situation like they know there's something they don't know. The players will almost resent the die roll and try to brute force the situation however they can to find out about whatever I'm hiding from them. Now, I hated this so much that I took 3 major steps to shut it down on my tables. The first is that I ask every player who takes a watch during a rest to roll a perception check. The results of their check have nothing at all to do with whether or not there will be a random encounter. And we'll talk about random encounters soon, because I think I finally found an approach I'm a lot happier with, but I need to play with it, and then literally play with it, before I discuss it on my channel. But by not always having a random encounter, regardless of whether the players roll low or not, it gets the players used to the fact that there will be times that they are asked to roll a perception check and they get a low roll, and then nothing bad happens. So when I call for a perception check in other occasions, and they roll low and they see nothing, then hopefully they won't all scramble all over each other to find another reason to roll a perception check just to try to see the thing they're convinced they missed due to their low roll. The second change was just leaning into passive perception more. Honestly, it exists for exactly this reason. If I just have a note of everyone's passive perception, then I can decide in the moment what someone does or doesn't see without calling for a roll, and that cuts down on the metagaming dramatically. That reminds me, I still need to add a section to my D&D notes for each session that includes everyone's passive perception. That would be a huge help when I'm playing online and I don't just want to have loose index cards all over my desk. That's my current solution, and it sucks. The third major change to my style I made was a system I employ to cut down on skill dogpiling. Basically, if I call for a player to make a perception check, but other players also want to try to make the same roll, they need to ask before the first person rolls their die. That way, they're making their decision based on what their own choice is, of whether they want to be involved or not, and not making the decision based on knowledge of whether a roll succeeded or failed. Now, as for players reacting to when I roll a die, I don't mind that as much. If there are times I don't want them to know I'm rolling and don't want them to react to that knowledge, I'll use the dice rolling app on my phone. But sometimes, hearing the DM roll a die and not knowing why it happened can act as a nice way to heighten the tension at the table. Even if that wasn't my goal, I don't regard that as a bad thing. Now, since we're talking about skills, let's talk about how players talk about their own character's skills. Character stat knowledge, aka, who has the highest perception? Who should make this roll? When players discuss their own stats and compare details with each other, that is a form of metagaming. But it certainly would not surprise me if this doesn't bother you at all, or if you don't even agree that it counts. Going back to Matt Colville's video, this is specifically an example of something he called out as not being metagaming, because the people of the world of the game would have another way of discussing that sort of information, because they live in the world. For example, the characters would be aware that they gain skill in battle the more they do battle, so it's not metagaming to talk about leveling up. The characters know that the rogue who wears light leather armor and can move around without being heard is sneakier than the paladin in full plate mail. But there are times when I really wish the characters would communicate this information in character in a way that actually made sense, as opposed to speaking completely through the terms of their character sheet. But there are degrees of difference here. It depends a lot on what the players are discussing. For example, when the players ask who has the highest survival skill when they're trying to figure out who should take the lead when traveling through the wilderness, it's undeniable that this is something that makes perfect sense. The people of the world would have a pretty good sense of who can follow tracks, or identify dangerous plants, or navigate downwind of predators. But sometimes, I'd much rather have someone take the lead not just because they happen to be a cleric with the highest wisdom score that happens to boost their survival skill, but because they really do just want to lead the group through the wilderness. I really wish if my players were going to have a discussion about who should take the lead, they would at least factor in how their characters are making that decision without relying on their character sheets to make the final decision. Now, it's not something I tend to call out at the table because it's perfectly valid to want to play in a way where you can do so safely and smartly, literally putting your best foot forward by having your tracker lead the way. And if nobody wants to take the lead, then yeah, why do I care how they decide what order the party marches in? The fact that this discussion isn't making it so someone who wants to take the lead is being shut down because they don't have a high enough survival skill means nobody is getting hurt in this scenario, so that's why I don't call it out. Sure, it's a pet peeve, but it's one that I can live with. But there are a lot of different versions of this effect in games, and people have a lot of different feelings about it. For example, here's a wild example. I have 19 hit points left. That's metagaming, kind of. Certainly your player characters likely wouldn't describe their own physical injuries that way. And I've heard many stories of DMs trying to crack down on this, basically saying that their players can't say how many hit points they have to describe how they're feeling in character. But when you do that, a lot of players are just going to say something like, on a scale of 1 to 35, I'm at about a 19. Personally, I think players should just be able to say how many hit points they have. Not only is very little gained from asking them to obfuscate that information, but it can actually have a huge negative impact on certain class features or spells. For example, when I played a life domain cleric, I kept an index card with all the other party members' hit points on it. And as they took damage, I tracked it, so I knew where to spend my resources to keep people in the fight. I had a special power that gave my fellow player characters hit points as long as they were below half their hit point maximum, and I had a certain number of hit points I could assign and give out to whoever needed the most HP. Sure, technically that's a form of metagaming. My character couldn't actually tell at a glance how much harm each character took when they got hit with a sword or got set on fire, but the way my subclass worked relied on me being able to act on that information, and specifically knowing the precise numbers everyone was working with. If my DM had insisted that nobody could tell the cleric how many hit points they had or how much damage they'd taken, even though everyone is sitting at the table and heard the DM tell the player how much damage they took, then that would effectively make the life domain cleric a lot less useful. And that actively gets in the way of the player's abilities to play the game. That's one that I never cared about, although I can totally understand it being someone's pet peeve for the exact same reason I feel like discussing skills bothers me. Heck, I would even argue that the players referring to the difference between a barbarian and a fighter, or a cleric and a paladin, or knowing the difference between a warlock, a wizard, and a sorcerer, in character, is a form of metagaming. And this comes down to style, like so many of these things do. I'm at the point in my journey as a DM where I have no issues with players understanding how each other's abilities work, because that makes play go a lot faster at the table and clears up miscommunications more easily. But I really dislike the idea that the common people of the world would know almost any of these terms. Aside from bards and wizards and maybe monks, why would most common people use any of the rest of these terms in the same way we use to describe game features? Sure, high-level magic users would probably know the difference between a warlock, a sorcerer, and a wizard, but I have a hard time figuring out who, in the fictional fantasy world of the game, would know that a cleric and a paladin are different types of priests, or who would care to distinguish between a barbarian and a fighter, and honestly, between a barbarian and a ranger, or a fighter and a ranger. I've talked about this before. I hate when NPCs are referred to as rangers or barbarians because I don't think those terms make a lot of sense for what are, frankly, arbitrary distinctions determined entirely by game mechanics. So I don't like it when players use a lot of these terms as they're discussing NPCs or villains or lore in character. But there's another aspect of this as well that I frankly have no problem with. The acknowledgement of character levels. Level knowledge, aka we're too low level to head to that tower. Oreo, you are being so crazy out there. Now, while acknowledging your level is arguably a form of metagaming, and I sometimes have a problem with it because sometimes players are just wrong, like that example is a real thing I heard someone say about what was actually the lowest level location in the adventure. That player actually said that a lot during that campaign, and they were always wrong. But in general, I have no problem with players being aware of their levels. In fact, I'm planning out another West Marches game, and that sort of game really works best if the players are aware that some sections of the world are really low level, and some are medium, and others are high, so they don't get themselves into situations that are too dangerous for them and wind up dying in totally preventable situations. Another version of this is when players are aware of how they're going to level up. For example, if we get this magic item and or kill this creature, we will level up because of the milestone rules. Curse of Strahd works that way. There are certain relics that they need to obtain in order to level up to defeat Strahd. And while there are pluses and minuses to the milestone method, and using milestones can give players tunnel vision towards specific objectives and cut down on the motivation to explore regions more thoroughly, it also energizes players with an active plan, something they can work toward. And from my perspective, that's absolutely invaluable. So personally, I don't tend to sweat it too badly when the players discuss their levels. But of course, there's a type of metagaming that bothers me a lot when it's misused, and it's the last example we're going to discuss today. And it's my least favorite form of metagaming. Knowledge of a player character's secrets. Character secret knowledge, aka, my character is going to ask a lot of conspicuous questions about the thing I know your character is hiding. I've said before that I have another video coming up on this subject where I will hopefully be able to give it the attention it is due, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention it here all the same. This is a form of metagaming, and it can be truly disruptive. For example, I once had a player start asking another character a lot of questions about their background, where they learned magic, what kind of bard they were, all of that sort of thing. And it's possible you could argue that they were just a naturally curious person. But they didn't ask those questions of the druid or the monk, despite those characters being shrouded in just as much intrigue. Instead, they asked the bard. And why? Because they knew the bard was actually College of Whispers and was effectively posing as a different bardic college. That's something that College of Whispers bards do a lot, according to the lore. In fact, you can argue that perhaps that's the fun of the College of Whispers bard, and it's something that the other player was effectively undermining, because their version of fun was cracking this character's secret. Like I said, I've got a whole other video about that topic in the works, and this video is more than long enough right now, but this is one that absolutely drives me up the wall. It's my least favorite form of metagaming because it doesn't just impact me as the dungeon master. Most of these examples we've discussed really primarily bother game masters, at least with more consistency than they bother other players. But this is one that bothers me a lot because there's usually another major victim. The player who was trying to tell a cool story about having a secret. And they may have even started things off in the most responsible and respectful way they could, by sharing the secret with the other players in advance, in the session 0 maybe. But their hope was that the secret would come out naturally during the campaign, rather than one of the other players turning into an investigative reporter and refusing to trust anything they said unless it involved them admitting the secret in character that all the other players already knew about. And ultimately, Like I said, this comes from two contrasting approaches to having fun in a D&D game. And the best solution, ultimately, is to be super clear during a session 0 about how this sort of secret might unfold over the course of the campaign, and whether it will be done by that player dropping hints, or by the DM dropping plot-relevant complications that tie into that player character's backstory. But in my opinion, and this is a bit of a sneak peek into that video I keep promising, it shouldn't be the responsibility of other players to dig up dirt on the player character's secrets. In my opinion, it's less dramatic, it's unnecessary for everyone to have fun, and it signals a lack of trust in the players and the DM to not introduce a secret like this in a way that won't be disruptive to the fun of the other players or get their characters hurt or killed. If you can trust your DM and your fellow players, you should be able to just sit back and wait for the secrets to be revealed or at least hinted at in the most dramatic fashion. If you keep pushing, trying to figure out the secret on your terms when there have been no clues to hint at anything going on for you to learn about, you're effectively saying that you don't trust your collaborators. And I understand some players really don't like having secrets kept from them, and they especially don't want to be hurt emotionally or have their trust betrayed, so that's why they want to be in control of the way the information is uncovered. But that's why Session 0 is so important, because if two players have radically different feelings on, how secrets between player characters should work, then it might not be the right group for that kind of story, or might mean that this isn't the right group for one of those players. But like I said, we'll talk a lot more about that another day. That's the final example I wanted to discuss in this video, although I've no doubt that there are people watching who have come up with more examples that I haven't thought of, so please leave those in the comments below. I hope this video has helped. Like I said at the top, the tabletop RPG community talks about metagaming a lot, but sometimes I get the feeling that not everyone in the community is using the same definition. So I hope this video can serve as a bit of a Rosetta Stone, helping everyone get at least on the same page about some of the many versions of metagaming there are out there. Now, armed with this knowledge, I hope it will be a lot easier for you and your players to better communicate what kinds of metagaming bother you, and perhaps you'll understand why some people who have claimed to hate metagaming apparently don't mind it all the time, because metagaming comes in so many different shapes and sizes. And that type of metagaming that bothers you or doesn't bother you has a lot to do with the games you enjoy and some of your other pet peeves about the hobby. For example, I think it's very telling that my two least favorite forms of metagaming are the ones that take away the agency of other players. But you might have other aspects of the game that are more important to you, and so there are other forms of metagaming that get your goat. Like I said, this is a complex subject. There's a lot we can learn from each other by discussing this further. Thank you so much for watching. I was hoping this would be a nice, easy video about a simple subject, but it wound up being so much longer and more elaborate than I was expecting. Still, I think we covered a lot of terrific ground today, and I hope this helps you find an equilibrium in your own games, or at least better arms you to have more productive discussions in online spaces when trying to figure out what exactly other people are even trying to say when they complain about metagaming. If you want to support the channel, there are a few terrific ways that you can do that. The first is to subscribe and ring the bell to get notified about new videos as soon as they come out. The sooner you watch a video, the more YouTube recommends my channel, and that really helps with a lot of stuff. If you want to support me financially, you can join my Patreon. Every new patron at any dollar amount really helps this channel. That being said, patrons at $3 a month are going to start getting access to my notes from my Old West Marches campaign, and players at $5 a month got this video a few days ago, so there are some awesome rewards at higher tiers. If you can't support me financially right now, I completely understand. I would still love for you to join my Discord community and hang out with a bunch of wonderful people who are just so passionate about tabletop RPGs. And the fourth and final way to support the channel is by signing up for my newsletter, where I will occasionally keep you up to date on the latest things I've got going on. One topic we discussed today was communicating ideas of hit points, and if you want your players to find some other way of sharing how damaged they are besides just saying, I'm at 19 hit points, maybe check out my recent video on finding different methods of communicating hit points and armor class in your games. Even if you're not having that problem, still check it out. It's a great video. Until next time, play fair and have fun.